All right, Sarah Haider. I have really been looking forward to this conversation for months since we first connected. Welcome to the show. It's really great to meet you and good to have you on.
Great to be here, Dan. Thanks for having me.
My pleasure. Um, I want to start with your background. And I know we touched on the fact that we might be talking about your background before we started recording. My understanding is that you were born in Karachi, Pakistan, and you now live in the US and have for quite some time. We're going to talk a lot today about ideas and beliefs and culture. I would love to have the audience learn a little bit about your, I think, first roughly 7 years of your life prior to coming to the US. What do you remember from that time in Karachi and Pakistan in general?
Yeah, I mean, it's like all childhood memories. They're kind of, they're fuzzy at the edges. But what I remember clearly was being raised in a context where the West and America was such a foreign thing. I remember watching American shows and not understanding the language. And religiosity in Pakistan it's just like the air you breathe, right? It's everywhere and you take it for granted. And it wasn't until I arrived in America that I realized what was different about Pakistan and being raised in Pakistan. So, in my own internal understanding of, my life, the moment that was really eye-opening was just the first few months of coming to America and recognizing that this is also, the world. This is also a way that people live, and kind of being shell-shocked at first with the differences in Pakistan and in America. But I was raised in a relatively liberal household, and I always use that term "relatively" very carefully, and then go back and make sure that people understand what that means. In that, in my household, my parents were practicing Shia Muslims. They raised me that way. We took religion seriously in the way that many Muslims take religion very seriously. When I say relatively liberal, I mean relative to other Muslims and not to the average Christian or anybody really in the West, because the kind of religiosity practiced here is very different, and the scale looks very different. So the way that I was raised would be considered, I think, by most Westerners of any religion practically, but especially Christians and as very conservative.
Yeah. You said when you got here, I think the word you used was shell shocked. What about the experience of arriving in the US as a little girl, if you remember, was so markedly different from what your life and your culture had been like previously in Pakistan?
I mean, it's hard to pinpoint one thing that was so different because everything is different, right? I mean, the smells and sounds of the new country are different. I noticed very superficial things, like there was so much green here. In Pakistan, it's like, or at least in Karachi, it's just dirt roads and not a lot of grass, and I noticed that there weren't that many animals, except for in the home, cats and dogs. But in Pakistan, there are just animals, out on the streets. You go to a park and there's peacocks and an elephant, and you go to the beach and there are camels. So there's just everything about the way that I looked and smelled, and the water tasted different, the food tasted different, even the fruits and vegetables I was familiar with tasted different here. So it was everything, and I in terms of religion, that was not something that was immediately apparent to me because I was thinking about all these other things that were extremely different about America. I remember noticing the diversity of Americans, especially since when we first came to America, we were in New York. A lot of immigrants used New York as like the port to then move somewhere else. So we were in New York for a little bit. And I mean, New York City is such a diverse place. And I remember thinking, this is not what I expected. I expected uniform white people. And then, and there was just all these, different sorts of people, and they were speaking different languages. And I remember being surprised by that, and a little bit intimidated by it too. Those were sort of the very, very first things, and struggling to understand the language was just like one of the first battles of like coming to a new country. Literally being able to understand the people around you is extremely important. But I remember that when that came together in my mind, like when suddenly English became something I had just absorbed. And when you're young enough, I think you don't really learn it, or at least I don't remember learning it. I don't remember doing very much to learn the language. I just absorbed it like through osmosis, through my skin. It was just suddenly English was something I knew. And I remember at that point, my connection to this culture, my connection to Americans, just like sped down very, very quickly. And I became accustomed to this world very, very fast after that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Go.
I know we're going to talk a lot about religion during this conversation. And I think you're probably right. For somebody who is a young girl arriving in a new country, that may not be the first thing on your mind, the precepts of your religious ideology in comparison to those of your new country. But as you got older, and as you spent more time in the US, you mentioned that your family, I think your father was a relatively liberal Muslim. What do you remember about, coming into your own and your own evolution and thinking about religion as you became a teenager, a middle schooler, a high schooler? What's that story in your mind as you tell it now in reflecting on your growth and evolution towards the beliefs that you hold now?
Mm-hmm. Well, as the way it's interesting that you phrased it that way, the sort of the story I tell myself now, because it is markedly different from how I was experiencing it, and what I thought of my journey as I was leaving faith. It's hard to do hypotheticals of like what would have happened had I not come to the United States. Like, how would I have experienced religion, and would I have questioned these things the way that I had, or at the age that I questioned them? I'd like to think that I would have been a critical thinker anywhere, and there are, of course, lots of atheists and free thinkers in Pakistan, in the Muslim world, especially now. But for me, it was it was death by a thousand cuts, that eventually culminated in when I was about 15 or 16, around that time, when I started questioning it very deliberately and looking into my religion very deliberately. But even years before then, sort of the seeds of what became my apostasy were already laying and thriving. Just simple things like just encountering people of different belief systems, seeing that they were good people, noticing that when they articulated their belief system, it made sense to a degree, and it was even something that I could understand, why someone would adopt, why a good person would hold that ethical system. I remember even, when I was a very young girl, at an age that was probably inappropriate, I was having conversations about religion with other girls at school. Like, we would be running in gym, a track or whatever, and we're talking about our faith, and we're in fifth grade or whatever. But I remember a lot of just having a lot of those kinds of conversations, mostly with Christians, because that was the predominant faith of the people around me. I don't remember. I think I met my first Jewish person when I was in high school. So it was a while until I encountered anyone that wasn't Christian. Or Muslim, obviously. But I remember having lots and lots of conversations, even as a young girl, and all of those did something that I would not have recognized at that moment for what it was. But they laid the groundwork for the broader skepticism over, is this specific path be, objective truth.
Yeah.
And then what happened, the very explicit thing that happened that I do remember was meeting atheists for the first time. And I became friends with a few of them, and some of them began to, poke at me and my religiosity. And we would have these long conversations. And I remember one time, an atheist friend of mine, he had just left his faith recently. So he was in that militant atheist phase of being really angry at,
sure.
His parents were, I think, like evangelicals, like they were very, very religious. And he left his faith, and then he became a militant atheist, and he started trying to poke at everyone else around him. And I remember he gave me like a printed list of quotes from the Quran that were extremely offensive, just by themselves, right? And I remember thinking, this is wrong. What he's saying is wrong. There's a context that explains all this. And then I remember looking it up, and the context not only didn't make it better, it made it worse sometimes, and so that was, I remember, one of those moments where I thought, I can't support this. And then I also was kind of somebody who was evangelizing on my own. I was trying to convince other people to come and see the light of Islam. And so in doing so, in trying to convert them, I was doing research on, their faiths and why they were wrong, why you can't trust the historicity of the Bible. But it turns out that a lot of those same criticisms apply very neatly and directly to Islam and the Quran. And so that was a huge part of myself leaving the faith. And then there was the standard sort of teenage rebellion of, what happens, I think, to a lot of people who leave the faith, but also, with me, it was coupled with being at a certain age in my life where I was prone to rebellion anyway. So it made for an interesting couple of years for sure.
If you remember any of the points that, this atheist friend of yours, or just points in general that other people may have made around that time, I do think Americans are slightly better versed in some of the ideas of Islam than they would have been 20 or 30 years ago. But the counter arguments that these people would made to you that resonated with you, if you can remember any of those points that were made, what were those, and how do you think they stuck with you in such a way? It sounds like it was an ethical thing for you.
Right. I mean, it was partially an ethical thing. It was more than that as well, though. I remember we did a survey of with my organization, Ex-Muslims of North America. We did a survey of the community members, and we got about 570 something responses, and we asked them about what impacted them to leave the faith. And I would encourage your listeners to look up the findings of that survey. They're on our website. It's called the Apostate Report. But there, we asked them about what was the most important factor, or what was a factor, and what was the most important factor, and allowed them to pick between like human rights principles, internal contradictions within the Quran, contradictions between what Islam says is true about the natural world and what we know through science, and philosophical and logical issues about the existence of God and the problem of evil and that kind of thing. For myself, I remember the latter was very important, in that was kind of, I think I could have justified almost any ethical objection in my own mind if I did believe that the God was real. And he was, as we understood him to be, in the sense that he was omnipotent and omniscient. And if the God was both of those two things, I felt that my own intellect had to be, and even my own sense of ethics and right and wrong had to be submissive to his, because by definition he knew more, and by definition I did not. So I think I would have, even though those troubled me, those aspects of the Quran about women's rights and violence in general, they did trouble me. I would have justified them in my own head, one way or another. I would have jumped through those hoops, or just said that, look, I don't know, and this is something God knows and God understands, but I don't. So I would have also just relinquished my rationality and reason had I believed that this God was real. And that's a big, that's a big if, and that's a big condition. So for me, those sort of philosophical, like standard atheist arguments were very important to losing my faith in God. And as a consequence, I then became a non-Muslim. Some people go through it the opposite way. Some people become less Muslim first, and then they think maybe I'm just sort of a general monotheist and I support, deism or whatever. And then they slowly leave behind religiosity and maybe move towards atheism. For me, it was the atheism came first. And then I realized, oh, this means I'm not Muslim anymore.
Yeah. It sounds like, so if I'm hearing you correctly, the foundational block of a belief in a supernatural God was knocked out first, and then everything followed.
And then everything followed. Yeah. It just tumbled. It just collapsed. Right. I mean, it wasn't even a follow, because once that was something I had a doubt in, everything just felt like a house of cards immediately afterwards.
Yeah. It's like the ultimate red pill. The arguments that I would be curious to know about that transition specifically for you, because it sounds like that is really a crucial turning point in your thinking and your outlook about life and the world. Prior to changing your mind about capital G God, what had your belief been about such an entity? How would you have described that idea in the first place? And then what were the arguments that for you really were sufficient to change that cornerstone belief in your own outlook on life and on the universe in general?
I have a hard time remembering exactly, at what order which fell and what the because I'm trying to remember, but it was so long ago now. I remember the effect. I remember browsing random atheist websites for a while and absorbing those arguments. But it's hard to think about like which exactly was what really did it. I know that the way that I conceived of the God of the Quran was far more liberal than the way that I conceive of the God of the Quran now. And I think that could have just been the way that I had just absorbed Christianity in my, through my surroundings. And I find that there's kind of an interesting, this is a whole separate discussion, but I find when I talk to Muslims who grow up here in the United States and also surrounded by Christians and Christianity and spend a lot of time in intellectual circles, that their Islam is a little bit Christianized, like their God is much more loving than maybe the God is articulated in the Islam of the Muslim world. But I remember thinking of him as although Islam doesn't specify a gender, you call him. I remember thinking of him as compassionate. I remember thinking of him as just above all, but also unforgiving in a way that the Christian conception of Christ felt very foreign to me. And then my God doesn't seem as forgiving. He's sort of an Old Testament God almost in comparison to Christianity. But I remember thinking that Islam, and the way that I was taught it, was a way of life in a very full respect. It wasn't just an ethical belief system. It was a way to orient yourself around the world today, the modern world today. And so all the ways in which Islam failed to do that as a religion, all the ways in which it failed to to thrive in the modern world, given, it's very specific thoughts about how you should, participate in the world, how you should run your government, how you should organize, even, lending, right? That there's all these specific restrictions that didn't gel in very well with the world. And I remember thinking that there was a neat package that would help me really understand how to move about the world. And when it became clear that package was not so neat, that was a big, that was something that shook my faith. I remember specifically looking at the claims about the historicity of the Quran. That was a really big one for me, because the Quran wasn't written down as, the angel came and revealed things to Muhammad. Muhammad didn't write it down immediately. It wasn't written down for sometimes, for a long, long time afterwards. And then the way that the Quran was actually compiled was through like scraps and little bits of people remember Muhammad saying this or Muhammad saying that and had written it down, and then it was compiled together like that. And I remember just thinking, what? Like that? Like, I'm told that this is the literal word of God, and I'm just hoping that someone managed to write down what Muhammad said exactly word for word as it was. And then these scraps of memories were pulled together into the Quran, and that this is something that we are analyzing every word, we're analyzing even the order of things to see exactly how we should live our lives, but that doesn't seem to be a very clear document given the way that it came forth. So I remember that being just something that really made me feel uncomfortable with at least practicing the faith literally or taking it as a literal truth. I remember reading a lot about the prophets specifically. I remember Christ and his life, and there were Christian ex-Christian websites that would have all these takedown arguments of Christ and the miracles and all that. And a lot of those apply actually pretty directly to the Quran. Some of those miracles don't, but some of them do. Some of the way that we conceive of who we call Prophet Isa, who is Jesus, where this, he lived a similar life up until the end. So those had an effect as well.
Yeah. To a layman audience that is familiar with Islam superficially, how do you lay out the basics of what that faith is really all about, right? I mean, if Christianity is the story of the Son of God coming to earth and dying on a cross for all of humanity, what is the shorthand description that makes sense to you as to what Islam in its history really is all about, and that you think would help largely a Western audience understand some about its own history and its own goals?
I don't know if there's the focus of Christianity on a person, on Christ, on his life. Of course, Islam revolves around Muhammad and the Prophet of Muhammad and who he is, but it doesn't center him in the same way. I never had the same feeling of Muhammad, of holding him close in my heart, the way that I felt Christians felt, Christ. So I don't think that relationship is the same at all. I think we feel more about, the Prophet Muhammad is like, a glorified, Moses, to the way Moses would be to Jews. So he obviously is larger than life, and he's this incredible role model of how we should live our lives. But it isn't the story of Muhammad, the way Christianity sometimes feels like it's the story of Christ.
Yep.
So there isn't a parallel to the two people. I would say that first and foremost. But the interesting about Islam is that it really feels like a life system more so than a faith. There's those spiritual elements of it that are very important to Muslims, but there's practical elements of how you should go about your day-to-day lives that I don't think is the same with Christianity. Islam has things to say about government, and secularist governments have difficulty justifying themselves in Islam for that reason, because Muhammad was a statesman. He was a politician. Soon after he started talking about this new faith, he became a political leader. So political leadership, how to run a civilization, a society, that was always a part of Islam and Islam's history. So it's always been a part of how we conceive of the faith as well, as more than a faith, as more than just like this, we go on it, to this place on Sunday and we think about ethics. It's more than that. It's about all the different elements of your life, even your relationships. And Islam helps you navigate those, or at least it claims to help you navigate those. So there's aspects of it that kind of feel to me intuitively almost like an Eastern religion. And this is just a feeling. It's not, literally true, but in the way that, Confucianism helps you specifically understand, day-to-day relationships. It's more than just this, transcendent relationship with this deity. Islam kind of feels like a handbook to life. Do you see what I mean? So it's practical. The Quran is practical.
Yeah, and more comprehensive potentially in its specificity.
Certainly, certainly.
You mentioned this word earlier, apostasy, and I would be interested in knowing for yourself, as you began, to critically analyze your own upbringing, and then eventually deciding to leave. I think it's well known in the West that there tends to be a different relationship between ex-Muslims and current Muslims, and ex-Christians and current Christians. Obviously, that's often a contentious relationships in both directions. But people are often murdered for leaving Islam, and especially for those who speak out against it. Was that even on your mind when you decided as a young woman that this was an ideology, a religious framework that no longer made sense to you, that was a risk you were potentially taking, or was that so far from where you were that
I didn't even know of it?
Yeah,
I didn't even know it. I mean, that was just that's how far it was from my mind that I didn't even know what happens. And I didn't know anyone personally who was an ex-Muslim ever, or at least I thought I didn't know anyone. Later, after I came out publicly about leaving my faith, there were other people in my life that said, well, I don't really believe anymore. But that only happened years after I had thought that, I don't believe. But it was such a foreign concept, apostasy in general. The atheists that I knew in my life were all from, various Western faiths, first Christianity, but then I began to know people from Jewish faith too, who were, Jewish, but they didn't believe in God, kind of thing. And I didn't know anybody who was ex-Muslims specifically. And so this was something I had to navigate on my own. And I found it, at first I was just naive about the realities of apostasy. Just all I was consumed with was how messed up it was. I almost used another word, but how messed up it was that we, me, my family, my parents, my loved ones have been, torturously following this belief system, revolving our lives around it, shaping our future around it. And it turns out that it wasn't, that it doesn't have the claims to truth that I thought it did. I mean, I remember feeling angry And that anger consumed me for a very long time, and thinking of nothing else. So the fear, which is sort of a very different emotion, and I think fear you can feel more wholly when the anger kind of cools down. But at least in the first couple of years, I felt that this religion had robbed me of something, and it had robbed my family of something. And then it became clear to me that all these things that I had accepted as this is how the world works, this is how I'm going to get married, this is how my husband will be, and this is how we will raise our children. And, even the specifics of how I ate, how I dressed, what I wore, how I related to the opposite sex, which was it's a very key and important part of becoming a young adult. All of that was, revolved around this faith, and was held down by this faith. And now that those restrictions I felt were unjust or just based on nonsense, I began to feel very angry that they still applied to me in my life because I was a young woman in a Muslim household, right? So I still had to dress the way Muslims dress. I still had to live my life in that way because I was in these surroundings, and I slowly I had conversations with my parents that helped them understand my path. But like many ex-Muslims, I lived a double life for a very long time. I didn't tell them the extent to which I had really left behind not just Islam as the faith, but the lifestyle of a Muslim. So there was this sort of deception. I mean, that's the honest truth, for a very long time. And I think that helped ease the transition of me leaving the faith to my parents, because I think that if they had known of the way that I was going to live my life, they would be a lot more, I wouldn't say abusive is a term, but I think they would have felt that more, measures had to be taken to save me from this life. A lot of ex-Muslims have, experienced this in various ways, where parents, especially immigrant parents, will say, now it's time to go back home. Our child has been corrupted by the Western world, and we're going back to Egypt, back to wherever. So that was on the back of my mind, that my parents could just one day decide that they didn't want to be here. They didn't want their children to be around these corrupt influences, or even for me, if I had already been corrupted, to be able to live out my life in such a way, to be free enough in this society to do it. Whereas in Pakistan, I couldn't get away with it in the same way. That was always something I thought about, and it felt real to me. Of course, it's, you don't know, because I never really told them the full truth of how I was living my life. But that was a big issue. There was, on a more extended level, once the word got out about my apostasy, in my extended family, my parents began to receive a lot of pressure to take care of the problem of me, like to fix me somehow. And they themselves began to be ostracized from the community, to various degrees. And that still continues, on to this day, that they are treated in this stigmatized fashion, and they just don't have anything to do with parts of the community anymore. And that's because they refuse to treat me more harshly. And so I do feel very lucky that my parents did not, they weren't the threat to me. And that's the case with a lot of ex-Muslims. So there's obviously the, terrorists out there, but they're going to find you if you begin to speak about religion, right? I mean, but so long as you're a private person, you're living your life, really the threat to you is your family members, unfortunately, and then your extended community. And I was lucky there that I didn't have to fear them. Once I started to speak out about the faith, however, that changed, in the sense that the pressure that my parents began to feel was a lot more intense, and I began to fear for their safety, as just extensions of me. So then they had to live their lives differently as well. The way I have to live my life slightly differently, because I worry about the security aspects of being like an open apostate, and not just an open one, but a very public one and a very visible one. So, my parents can't go to Pakistan. Their own family, their own siblings have told them, don't come. It's dangerous for you. So it's these sorts of things, and it's tragic because they have family there that they'll never see again. And it's my fault, right? It's the choices that I've made that now restrict their lives in this extra way. But there's the obvious. The big change in my life happened when I began to be more open about my apostasy, and when I founded or co-founded Ex-Muslims of North America. And at that point, that was a real shift in my relationship also with the faith. There was just like, this is just a system that's untrue, to this is a system that is untrue, and it is it's a danger to myself and the people around me in a very visceral, real, way. You can't help but feel a little bit more, antagonistic towards, a religious group that does this. That's been sort of the growth of hostilities as, faced by an apostate.
Yeah. I had Wilfred Riley on my show about a month ago, and he wrote a book about taboos. And the book is essentially about American taboos. But I think the general point that he makes about taboos is taboos and censorship tend to be put in place not to protect strong arguments from criticism, but to protect weak arguments from criticism. It's essentially a move in order to prevent any criticism from being introduced because the edifice is so weak. I would love to talk to you about that moment for yourself, where, if I heard you correctly, you didn't know any ex-Muslims when you were younger. No. And then you decide to go and make this public. I'm sure with full knowledge that there is at least some serious risk here of taking your life in this direction. Why did this matter enough for you? And what was your reasoning just internally to yourself as to why you wanted to do this with your life?
I've always been kind of an activist, as a young person, I was always just, motivated to, as I said, I was evangelizing, to Christians that I knew about my faith, and trying to get them to see the light from that perspective, even though, I'm a minority in this country, and here I am preaching about my foreign religion. And even after 9/11, which changed the atmosphere quite a bit, in terms of how Muslim Americans felt in America, in their place in American society, they just felt more vulnerable. That didn't stop me from talking about it and trying to get people to see the light of my faith. I guess I feel very privileged. I feel lucky that I'm in the United States. I feel lucky that I have the upbringing that I had. It was just enough religiosity to get me to see how it can, really devastate a life or restrict someone's life so much that it, distorts it into something completely different than what they would have chosen on their own. But just free enough that I could escape. And a lot of ex-Muslims just simply don't have this. And it became very clear to me as I started to meet other ex-Muslims and find other ex-Muslims that I was extremely privileged with my experience, that I never really worried that my father would kill me. I was never concerned about that. Maybe he would take me back to Pakistan. That was real, but not that he would hurt me. And it was just when I fully reckoned with the fact that other ex-Muslims were not in this boat, even in the West. It felt to me that, if you happen to be lucky enough to have an easier life, then it's your duty to try and create that life for others. And so when I started to work on, ex-Muslims in North America, and very quickly recognized that initially what we were doing, which was community building, was just not enough. We had to speak out publicly. I remember there was a point where I looked at the life of Ayaan Hirsi Ali, and she was the only other ex-Muslim that I had even heard of at that time, like in the public space. And I remember this in my mind. I remember thinking, I don't want her life. Like, I don't want to run for the rest of my life. I don't want to worry about my loved ones. I don't want this. And it almost made it worse that she was there, that someone had done it before.
Yeah.
In a way. And I could see exactly what happened to her. And it would be one thing if I just optimistically just followed that path without knowing exactly where it would take me. But with Ayaan, with her example, because people have asked me, like, did she inspire you? I mean, like, in a way, but the way that she was treated, like what she met at the end of her public apostasy, was something that I was like, I don't want to live that way, and it's almost like you escape religion and, you live your life in this restricted way. And you find this freedom to be yourself, to be public, to feel free. And then you come out as an apostate and you're restricted again. Now you can't travel in certain places. Now you can't be open about certain things. Now you have to be careful about, where you go and what you do. And it feels like going back into that restricted space. But this time it was by choice, but this time I wasn't, born into it. It's something that I chose to do. So it does feel different from that perspective.
Yeah. And I want to give the audience a little bit of background there, along with some other historical points that might be helpful for people to recognize how serious this is. So there are a few things I want to mention. One is the Salman Rushdie affair in the late 80s, where he published a book called The Satanic Verses, which subsequently led to a fatwa being issued against him, which is essentially a death sentence, instructions from the leader of Iran to kill him. In the 2000s, there was the Danish cartoonist who published satirical cartoons of the Prophet Muhammad, which caused deaths around the world. And no American publishers would print, out of fear, would print those images except for Free Inquiry magazine, which is the magazine of the Center for Inquiry. I happened to work there a few years after they did that. There was the Charlie Hebdo affair in Paris, where I think something like 12 people were killed. And I read Ayaan Hirsi Ali's book as well, Infidel, which is a terrific book. And one of the most poignant moments in the book is her telling of the story of beginning to make a documentary about her life that was, if I remember correctly, critical of Islam, with, of all people, Vincent van Gogh's distant relative, Theo van Gogh. The name of that documentary was called Submission. And it was publicly going to be criticizing Islam and aspects of Islamic culture. And he was murdered Theo van Gogh was murdered in broad daylight with a knife stuck in his back and a note attached to it saying, Ayaan Hirsi Ali, you're next. She was a member of their parliament, I believe, at that time, and fled to the West, which I think is what you're alluding to, that she has been on the run for a lot of her adult life. And I want to just set the table there to give some context for her story and to just provide some historical facts that I think bolster your concern that this is serious. And there are people out there who are willing to inflict serious violence against people who are critical of Islamic faith. And I remember just personally when I was living in Buffalo, when I was working for the Center for Inquiry, which owns Free Inquiry magazine, and they published the cartoons at that magazine. There was a couple in suburban Buffalo at that time, and they owned a television station. Their goal was to try to introduce, you probably remember this story. The goal was to try to introduce a more modern version of Islam to a Western audience. And if I remember correctly, the wife was no longer happy in the marriage and wanted to get a divorce. And the husband essentially enacted an honor killing and in a gruesome manner, essentially decapitated her. These are a few examples of many that I think just bolster your claim that this is a dangerous field to go into for anybody who is so inclined. And I want to talk to you about why you think there is such concern. I mean, this has happened to Ayaan Hirsi Ali. I've seen this happen to her for years now. She begins to point out her criticisms of the way women are treated in so many Muslim cultures, in the limits of free speech and, liberal values that are the bedrock of America and Western civilization. And many people have no problem immediately calling her a racist or anti-Muslim. How do you make sense of that immediate move? It would seem to me that in the better angels of Western civilization, we could walk and chew gum at the same time. Mm-hmm. We would be able to realize that what we're really concerned about are the ideas, and we have a deep love for Muslims as people, and we can orchestrate conversations that are oriented in that manner to try to make a more just, humane world. For people who are not particularly, well versed on Muslim civilization and Muslim countries, when there is such a reaction to people like you, to people like Ayaan Hirsi Ali, who are publicly criticizing components of Islam that, to my eyes, are, barbaric and don't seem to have a place in the world in 2022. They certainly wouldn't be welcomed in most American households and families. First of all, what are some of those practices that are going on in Muslim cultures that you find so objectionable ethically? Mm-hmm. And why do you think there is such resistance to shedding light on those components of life for Muslims now? Why are people so worried about changing these institutions, changing these belief structures?
Yeah, both of those questions are big ones. I will try to keep my answer somewhat brief. As to the first, what practices, specifically that I think are toxic or harmful, that the religion either formally, promotes or accepts as part of the faith. I mean, they run the gamut from human rights issues, specifically when it comes to women's rights. I mean, Islam is a gendered religion in that, in order to be a good Muslim woman, you behave. There are different ways that God wants you to behave than if you're a good Muslim man. Islam formally gives men the right to discipline their wives. And this is hadn't been contested at all by anyone until Western, academics and activists pointed it out, until the West met the East, and at that point, some Muslims began to taper down a little bit on the how much that it allows husbands in service of this disciplining, but it's formally an acceptance of domestic abuse, of domestic violence. Women do not have, simple rights like the right to divorce that is, clear and equal to a man. So in Islam, a man can say, "I divorce you 3 times," and you're divorced. But if a woman wants a divorce, she can formally request it from her husband. He can decline, At that point, she can go to a religious leader and request it there. And if the religious leader accepts, then she can get a divorce. But you see just the differences in treatment and rights and simple basic rights. Islam doesn't, the woman doesn't have custody of her children after, I think it's the age of 6. The children belong to the father at that point. So there's a very explicit issues when it comes to Islam that in some countries they are very literally practiced. Inheritance laws are extremely unequal. Women do not have the right to, daughters do not have the right to equal inheritance. In many countries, this is enacted into law. In Bangladesh, I remember when my close friends had an issue with this, or when her father, her brother died, and she was the only child of her father, and he found out that she was going to have difficulty inheriting all of his estate, that he would have to give a generous portion to male cousins, and so that it's a very real thing, even in more secularized countries like Bangladesh. In countries like Saudi Arabia, you have very literal interpretations of guardianship laws, of Islamic precepts that say that a woman should not travel certain distances without a male guardian, without a male protector, which has to be her brother, her father, or her husband. But these restrictions play out in the lives of Saudi women, and so that they can't leave the country without permission from a father. And so it varies in Muslim countries to what degree specifically the inequalities of women in Islamic practice play out, but they're always pulling in one direction, right? I mean, Islam isn't granting women any kinds of rights. Islam is taking them away. We know a lot about the hijab, for example, enforced hijab in Iran and in Afghanistan and in Saudi Arabia. But I think the lesser known aspects of it, also like inheritance laws and custody rights, also have an incredibly complex, but it's just the superstructure of gender inequality that affects Muslim women all across the board. And that's one aspect of the human rights harms that I think that I can speak to. But obviously there's restrictions that impact gays and lesbians and anyone really who wants to live their lives in a gender non-conforming way. But the human rights issues are one. There's the way that Islam views freedom of expression and freedom of belief, in which Islam is a religion that is in a Muslim society should be granted a superior status to other faiths. This plays out in Muslim culture in various ways. Minorities are heavily stigmatized, persecuted, in danger really for their lives in many Muslim countries. This has an effect on freedom of speech, and of the cases that you mentioned of Charlie Hebdo, of the Danish cartoons, of Salman Rushdie, that these restrictions of what you can criticize, what you can mock, even apply to non-Muslim countries, where Muslims take it upon themselves to say that this cannot happen anywhere in the world where we take part. There's general effects on society as a whole, on how you structure, a secular government, on how what kind of liberal rights you may grant to citizens, that has an effect on, scientific inquiry. It has an effect on, artistic expression. It has an effect on technological progress. And so there's very specific literal harms that we can talk about. And then there's the broader effects on civilization that accepts Islamic, understanding of the world as a correct way to live your lives. And you see this in Muslim countries that have a very difficult time meeting the challenges of the modern world, and gaining a foothold in the prosperity that the rest of the world enjoys, and that is not due to a lack of talent and intelligence, of Muslim people. It is due to the fact that it is artificially suppressed in a variety of ways, almost all of which can be pointed back to belief in this faith. So that's my answer to that one question.
Yep.
But the other one that you pointed out as to why we have difficulty in the West with someone like Ayaan Hirsi Ali, I mean, there's a lot to that. I think there's the simple answer of we have, in our conception of what tolerance looks like, it means in a very simplistic sense, acceptance, unquestioning, uncritical acceptance, and kind of a condescending allowance to other cultures. That certain practices can happen there, and who are we to judge? I even had the "who are we to judge" response when it comes to FGM, from a gender studies professor. I remember it to this day. When this woman who was so learned in women's rights, female empowerment, and I remember her saying to me, "Who are we to judge?" When it came to cutting girls' genitals in such a way that they could not experience sexual pleasure. And I remember thinking that there's a point of which tolerance becomes in itself, it becomes, it undoes itself if it doesn't have any principles
Backbone
to moor itself down to. And if those principles, I think we're cutting out. Can you still hear me?
I can. Yeah.
Okay. I think my recording is messed up because I can barely hear you.
Okay. Turn that up. I can hear you just fine.
Okay. So I remember that FGM issue really, really shook me. That I couldn't understand how anyone could justify it. And I remember thinking that we have to revisit what we think of as tolerance, and we have to revisit how we approach, issues of how to live together with other countries in a way that we're not imposing our values, we're not justifying war, we're not justifying aggression, but at the same time being able to hold our own and say, well, we think this is right, and we think these values should be shared, across the world. We just have trouble with this. Some of it is due to just like not wanting more aggression in Muslim societies, and that's a very good. That's something I agree with. I don't think military action wins hearts and minds. I don't think it'll change the Muslim world. It certainly hasn't in Iraq. It certainly hasn't done Afghanistan any favors. But I also think there's something deeper going on in the Western world that is unconnected to this issue. There is I would not to be too extreme about it, but I think there is a rot in Western intelligentsia. There is an undoing of Enlightenment values that there's a project that is currently underway, and we can see it affect 100 different avenues of relating to culture, and we can see it play out. Where we even look back to our own history and we demonize it in a way that is not. It's one thing to look back in history with clear eyes and say that these are the injustices we visited upon others, and it's another to look back and see nothing but evil and contempt. So I could go on about this for a very, very long time, and it's kind of been my focus more recently has been investigating what exactly is going on here. That in the West, even saying something like I support Enlightenment values is coded as conservative or right wing, and what does that even, how can that be true? What does that mean? And what has led us to this point? And I think it's a very deep problem. I think it's rooted in a lot of different kinds of movements, even legal structures. Islam is just, the treatment of Islam is just a symptom of what's going on here. But I think that we have a fight ahead of us, and one that I feel very powerfully like inclined to participate in. I mean, this is a country and civilization that gave me rights and freedoms that I couldn't have imagined, anywhere else. And it's shocking and unnerving and upsetting to see this civilization, which has been a hope to people like me and continues to be a hope that maybe one day Pakistan will be as free as the West, to have people then denigrate the project of the kinds of liberal values that the modern West rests upon, and to see that being slowly being chipped away. The foundations of it being chipped away is, deeply upsetting, because the project of moving the rest of the world to the West is an important one. But what if there's no West to move to, right? Like, what if the West manages to disempower itself in such a way that it cannot understand its own values, much less champion them anywhere else? So that's I could go on about it for a very, very long time, but I think there's a bigger problem here.
I think you hit the nail on the head, and I think rot is a good way to put it. The FGM, just for listeners, is female genital mutilation. I think what you're getting at is the belief these days that seem to be held by a lot of the energy and the intelligentsia that of cultural relativism. And it is such an odd thing to witness as somebody who is outside of that world, the allegiance between feminist, professorials, intelligentsia, and Muslim dictators who are, I think it's objective to say this, who are suppressing female equality. That's a very odd dynamic to be witnessing in real time. And I think I said this before we started recording, that even though what is happening in Russia with Russia and Ukraine is not a religious war, it has been somewhat heartening to me to witness a clarifying effect on at least the leadership, and I think the populace as well, of Western countries in snapping back into focus of what it is about our civilizations that are so precious and have been so hard won over so many centuries, and the miracle that despite all of our flaws and the horrendous history in many ways, the liberties that have been granted to people who live here. I know we're getting short on time, and so I want to close first just by saying how much I respect what you do and admire what you do, and I think I speak for a lot of people in saying that, because I know you're aware of the fact that this is not without its dangers, as we have talked about. And I think you're right. I feel similarly in terms of the privilege to be able to do work like this and to host conversations like this, because I think they really matter. I'd love to talk to you about the future. You said earlier that we have a fight on our hands, or a battle on our hands, and we certainly do. As the leader of this organization, as the co-founder, what do you feel would be, or think would be, success in your career? What are your hopes and goals for how ideas can spread, conversations like this can be shared, just in general? If I'm hearing your story correctly, it sounds like what you would like to have happened is to have girls like yourself have the opportunities and freedoms that you did, fundamentally. And as you think and forecast into the future, how do you think about that project? What is there to be optimistic about? What is there what are the seemingly insurmountable obstacles, if they're, and I know they're numerous, that you see clearly that need to be faced?
Yeah, I mean, the project that I'm focused on now is to help, to do what I can to help others understand the importance of the values and freedoms that not only, like, girls in the Muslim world just haven't even reached, they can't even aspire to at the moment, but to at least get the West to remember that these are things worth fighting for.
Yeah.
And these are things worth being, proud of, to the degree that anyone should be proud of the accident of birth, right? But to champion it, and also understand that it is your duty to some degree to champion it. It feels like to me that the many people in the West, especially many young people, my age, younger, they don't know what it is like to live in any other kind of time. Young women, especially, they have been granted a lot of freedoms in the West, and I don't know if they can really intuitively know what it is like to not have certain things. And I think that's part of the reason that we see sort of this youth movement that feels very anti-enlightenment in a lot of ways. And I think that's part of the reason is that they don't know what it is that they're risking. They don't know what it is to live without certain guarantees and certain freedoms. They are pushing back against what they feel to be, the oppressor. Pushing back, say, against freedom of speech because bigotry exists that can be spoken, without understanding that it is in fact freedom of speech that guaranteed them, the rights that they have at the moment, that allowed them to argue and to convince and persuade, and then eventually get into law the kinds of protections that they don't even think about anymore. They don't have to worry about it anymore. So my project at the moment is to try and do what I can to educate some of these people, and to organize those of us who see the problem and might want to do something about it. So that's something that I've been thinking about a lot in the future, and that's something that I'm currently focused on to whatever degree we can. And I think that when I say the fight is still ahead of us, I really mean that the Enlightenment project has been so neglected because it won, right? I mean, it's sort of the fruits of its successes were that people were allowed to forget about it.
Yeah.
And now we're in a state where even our major institutions no longer value this. So although it may seem that, there's a David and Goliath situation, but the Goliath is the Enlightenment norms, it is actually, I think, the opposite in a way, that these Enlightenment norms have sort of disappeared into the background. No one values them anymore. And indeed, the major institutions of this country and even the civilization are actively working to dismantle them, to denigrate them as values even. So I think we have to start organizing. And it's just shaping up, I think, this movement of people who are just even becoming concerned that there is a problem and recognizing that something's wrong. So I think we're in the early stages of this reorganization. As to my part with ex-Muslims in North America, I'm going to do what I can to highlight, not just to work for the rights of Muslims and ex-Muslims to dissent against their religion, but to use that as an example of helping Westerners understand that there's something to fight for here, and what it looks like, what a world looks like without these norms and guarantees.
Yeah. I think that is a life worth living. And Sarah, I just want to say before we close off, thank you very much for doing this and taking the time to have this conversation. I know I said this earlier, but I have a ton of respect for what you and your coworkers are doing, and I wish you a ton of luck in that endeavor. I think it's worthy of your time and energy.
Thank you, Dan.
Thanks for doing this, and go kick some butt. Thanks
for having me.
My pleasure.
This is great. Thanks.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Keep Talking. If you're finding value in this podcast, please consider supporting the show via the links below on Venmo, PayPal, or Patreon. Your support helps to make these conversations possible.